Oh, thank you very much for coming on a Saturday morning, and in particular, thank you, André, for coming all the way from London to throw some bullshit. I guess I should begin by sort of apologizing in advance for saying the word shit a lot. I was sort of brought up in Scandinavia in a very young culture where we don't have manners like you, sort of francophones and anglophones, but my mother did say to me that sort of using that word isn't a nice thing. Although we are justified in using that term because it actually has a very good meaning, as Andrew argues in this book, because there's a very good reason for using jargon in our lives, and we'll be exploring why. But you know, there's a particular type of jargon that we shall label bullshit and sort of explore to great extents today. So, André, I just learned the word brain date from Carl Moore. Carl Moore was doing a lot of stuff in this C2 event, which is a big sort of event here in Montreal, and they talk about brain dates between people. So how would you respond to a term like brain date? Are we having a brain date now?
I guess we are. Been invited all the way from Montreal to have a brain date with Saku. What could be better?
So that's, you know, it's remarkable how we come up with these new terms that sort of, when I think of a brain date, I'm thinking of neurosurgery. That's sort of somebody drilling open my skull and looking at my brain and has a date with my brain. But apparently it means that they're not sort of having an intimate type of date. They're not dating to sort of, you know, engage in intimate relations, but rather exploring ideas. So that's why it's a brain date. You also talk about thought showers in your book. So what is a thought shower?
Apparently it's a kind of a new, they used to use the term brainstorm, but it was offensive for people who had epilepsy, apparently. So they decided that...
So
so
thought
they
shower
decided
would
that they
be
would have
better.
a thought shower instead.
Okay. Good. So let's look. I have a couple of materials with me for our discussion, and you know, many of them will be hosted by Lucy Callaway, who used to be associate editor for the Financial Times, who wrote a long-standing column. And so let's get a couple of more examples from Lucy now in this video.
For the last quarter of a century on the FT, I've been writing articles that take the piss out of the way that managers talk. Someone asked me the other day how much effect I thought I'd had. The honest answer to this is that I've had no effect at all. While I've been writing these articles, things have gone on and on, getting worse. I've just done a little bit of digging in the archive, and the first example that I can find of me writing one of these pieces was back in 1994. And I wrote something saying that things had got so bad, that the way that managers spoke was so ugly, that there would have to be a correction, things would have to start getting better. But what were the words back then that I really objected to? Well, they were global, downsize, and marketplace. And even more than that, I objected to the way that people talked about being 110% committed to something, you know, hating the mathematical nonsense of it all. Well, what an innocent time that now seems, when things have truly got so much worse. I mean, the other day, I was sent something written by an entrepreneur in his blog where he declared he was 1,000,000% committed. So that really is inflation for you.
Okay. So, business bullshit. So, jargon, I suppose, is any type of language that we see from the outside. You know, somebody who doesn't know a speciality and hears somebody who's a specialist talk, you know, we hear a lot of jargon. And here's some examples. Say in the surgery room, where's the defibrillator? I can't even pronounce defibrillator. Behind you, electrodes are checked. We had an asystole in reaction to laryngoscopy. We treated it with atropine and 30 seconds of heart massage. I'll intubate once we've finished and we'll call for an OR nurse. Put him in the prone position afterwards. And you see the sort of the source there. So, that's jargon, certainly. It's language that's alien to us. Another example, tangible capital assets. Capital assets owned by the board are being depreciated on a systematic basis over their estimated useful lives. And the provision for depreciation was calculated on a basis consistent with that of the previous date. And so on, you can read the rest there. So both of these are jargon, examples of jargon from the outside, but they're not bullshit, are they?
Yeah, so we often think about jargon being something which is impenetrable. So if any of you are lawyers in the audience, you have legalese, right, which is a language designed to make people go to sleep, to not understand what you're saying, and then pay a lot of money to you while you're engaged in it, right? But most of the time, legalese and this kind of jargon has a purpose. It's referring to something. It's technical language which actually refers to things which exist in the world.
Right.
Whereas if you begin talking about, and this I'm quoting here from an email, well-known email called the "Hey There" email from Nokia, which was I think dozens, like 2,000 or 3,000 words long. When you're talking about a digital lifestyle experience or a strategic envelope or something like this, you don't quite know what that actually is, right?
Yeah.
And you read through, and much corporate life is full of these things like issue scanning, inboxing, ideation. You have ridiculous job titles, my favorite being the Innovation Sherpa.
Okay.
So these are kind of empty because they don't really say anything. They don't point to anything. And the reason which I chose the title for this book, there was a very fantastic, very short book, which was by a philosopher, Harry Frankfurt, who's at Princeton. And in this, it's called On Bullshit. And he was taking kind of offense about a very specific issue in his own field in philosophy. And he said, well, what you have is three types of statements. You have truth, which describes things which exist in the world which exist and true. You have lies, which are things which aren't correct. And then you have bullshit. And bullshit for him is talk without respect for the truth. He makes the point that if you think about a liar, they have respect for the truth, but they just want to avoid it as much as possible. Whereas the bullshitter is like, well, we'll talk about this and that and the other thing and blah, 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 with no actual reference to anything at all. So I think that's what's different between the jargon we see here, which is useful, a technical language, which is a shortcut for experts to talk about something, and bullshit, which is a way of talking about nothing.
So even though I might have difficulties, pronouncing the term amygdala, so if I have a brain date with a neurosurgeon, I'm kind of happy that he would know what that would actually point to.
Indeed.
It's gonna be, but so it's jargon, but it's not bullshit. Bullshit also is not lying, but it's avoiding the truth. So avoiding getting into an area where you have to actually sort of determine whether something is true or not.
Indeed. So if you look at a lot of kind of strategy in some ways, often it's full of this. So an example of this in our public broadcaster in the UK, the BBC, you have talking about we believe in better. And the director of better. What's that? Better than what kind of thing? So there's kind of often empty talk which could refer to anything and everything. And it's a way of kind of filling the corporate airwaves without actually committing and saying anything.
And can I ask, how did you become interested in this yourself?
Well, I suppose, I work in a business school, so I'm knee-deep in it in many ways. But the real moment I became interested in this is we were doing a big research project looking at kind of culture change in banks following the LIBOR scandal and all of these various kinds of scandals. And we went down to Canary Wharf in London, up to the 30-something floor, and we met the people who were running a big culture change project for a very large UK bank. And myself and my colleague, Jean-Pascal, who you know, sat down and began listening. And first, the head of culture or something begins talking, blah, 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 20 minutes later. Then the other person takes over and begins talking, blah, 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 for 20 more minutes. Great, this has been a fantastic meeting. We're shown to the lifts and sent down. And then I walk out and say, well, that was really impressive. And then I take away the tape recorder which I had and listen back to it. And I realized they spoke for 40 minutes and did not say anything at all. So how is this that people can talk for 40 minutes and say absolutely nothing? And that's when I then began to realize, okay, we have something. And I realized that I have this experience constantly when I go and talk with business people or listen to something. Even in my own committee meetings, you can take a 2-hour meeting and nothing is said. And it struck me that this is one of the things, aside from emails, that people hate the most about their working day, is empty meetings where nothing is achieved and a lot is said, but nothing really of substance.
Yeah. And it seems that this is kind of a process that's escalating. That, if you listen to Lucy talk, it seems that, the language is getting more and more bloated in some ways.
So when I began doing research on this, I started to try and look for the roots of it, go back in history. And one of the first kind of, real times when business bullshit begins to take over, I think was in Pacific Bell in about 1984. They moved from being a sleepy public utility to kind of privatized enterprise. And what they did was bring in some consultants in order to change the culture. And they brought in a consultant whose name was Charles Crone. And he was inspired by a Russian mystic by the name of George Gurdjieff. And he wanted to then implement this new, there we go, business bullshit, implement this new kind of culture, which was around, using all of this language like envisioning ideal states and blah, 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 blah. And it got implemented, they put it in place and they wanted to train every single person working in Pacific Bell for this. And they got through training about 40,000 people of, the 90,000 or whatever who were working at Pac Bell. And it became a statewide scandal. So people were saying things to the journalists like, when an outsider turns up to our meetings, they can't understand anything that's being talked about. Or what used to take 1 hour now takes 4 hours to do. Oh. And the California legislature actually had a big inquiry into this, and they decided to stop it happening, right? So it was a scandal. Now if you look at the language which was used at Pac Bell, it's commonplace. Everyone uses it. So that in some ways then it's taken over. The other thing which was interesting is that there was a young computer programmer working at Pac Bell at the time whose name who basically wrote the Dilbert cartoons. Right. So we see two kind of effects of this. One, on the other hand, they gave us this language. On the other hand, it's kind of produced the mockery of it at the same time.
Yeah, so my favorite Dilbert, I suppose everybody has one, is that where the pointy-head manager sort of gives a speech and says that it's a new reality. If you don't like it, you can leave.
Yeah.
All right. So, but let's explore the reasons for it. So, why is it? So, we can all agree that it's kind of funny. It's frustrating. It's a problem, I suppose. But sort of, why is it that we see so much of it? So, let's hear from Lucy first.
So it's not only that things have got worse in aggregate. Some of the particular managers who I've singled out over the years have gone on and on getting worse despite my taunts. Now, nobody has provided me with more column fodder over the years than Howard Schultz at Starbucks. But his latest was this. He described Starbucks roasteries as delivering an immersive, ultra-premium, coffee-forward experience. So in one short phrase, the only okay word was Anne. But I don't actually think this means that my entire life's work has been a failure. Okay, the people who talk bullshit will go on doing that because it doesn't do them any harm. And this is the most depressing thing. Howard Schultz has done perfectly nicely, more than perfectly nicely in talking this way. He's changed the whole way that half the world drinks, slurping out of those awful cups with the plastic lids. And he's amassed a fortune of about $3 billion, so it clearly hasn't hurt him. But the good I think I have done is to those few of us who don't talk this way. And we like to mock the people who do. So I think to them, I've delivered, as they would say, quite a service.
Then again, Lucy Callaway, she's an inner city London school teacher now. So she resigned as associate editor of the Financial Times and perhaps gave up. I don't know what happened with her. So why is it that we see so much of it. So it clearly needs to serve a purpose,
Yeah.
this type of language. So why is it?
Why? Well, I think there's a range of reasons why. I think one of the reasons is the rise of what an anthropologist in London called David Graeber calls bullshit jobs. These bullshit jobs, he defines, are jobs which the person doing does not think should exist.
The
Right?
innovation Sherpa, for instance?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the interesting thing is you assume that there's lots of people who think that their job is important, everyone thinks their job is important. Not the case. They did a survey a few summers ago in the UK asking a simple question: would society be better off if your job did not exist? 42% of UK men said yes to that statement. So there's a lot of people who essentially believe their job has no purpose, shouldn't really be there, and they need to fill it with something, right? And often it becomes kind of a fountain for this kind of business bullshit in some ways.
Okay.
The second bit, I think, is image creation. So we live in an economy now where the US economy, according to a recent estimate, is 30% of the US economy is about persuasion, right? So it's about creating fluff and image and so forth, where you need to, basically a central part of what the economy does is image creation, talk, empty talk often, which is completely dissociated from the actual things which are being sold. So this morning when I woke up, there was an advert for I don't know, grass seed or something like this on television, and it was like as if this guy's life was going to change by planting some grass seed, basically. And I thought about the amount that went into making this grass seed commercial compared to the other things which might be done with the resources. So image creation is an important bit. The third bit is simply being polite, right? So I'm sure some of you in the audience have been to one of these awful team building kind of events where you've been required to do some kind of crazy stuff. I've been forced to go to a team building event where we had to draw our own personal mandala, and then we had to communicate with people. But we had to introduce ourselves, but not verbally. But we had to introduce ourselves using dance moves. And I knew this was BS, but I also didn't want to seem like an a-hole, right?
Okay.
So I went along with it. And then when I walked out, one of my cynical British colleagues said to me, "That was just so much bullshit." And I said, "Yeah." But I didn't speak up about it at the time.
Okay.
And I should have perhaps felt, what would I say, kind of glad that it wasn't. Then I looked into this, and there's more extreme examples of this. So I've met a woman sometime whose business card said, her tagline was, "You can lead people, but can you lead a horse?" Or I've met people who, apparently there was an Australian company who would take people away on team building activities, and they'd have to dress up as characters from Scooby-Doo, right? So there's this sense that people go along with it because they want to be polite, and we naturally want to be polite. So those things are all fine, right?
Yeah, those are sort of pretty benevolent sounding.
But there's kind of more dangerous aspects, I think. One of the most dangerous aspects really is around bureaucracy, right?
Okay.
We talk about living in this post-bureaucratic age, but bureaucracy, as we all know, is absolutely everywhere. And we're demanded to be more bureaucratic in all sorts of things. And often it takes the forms of things like government regulation, rankings and rating systems, basically putting up this show that we're doing these things. I remember talking with a person working in a municipal municipal government, and they said, well, we had the regulator in, and they asked us to develop a very complex strategy to improve our services. And we said, okay, so what did you do? Well, we came up with a list of 10 action points and lots of evidence around it. And then I said, well, so did something change? And he said, well, after we'd spent all our time coming up with a strategic plan, there was no time to actually do anything about it or implement it. So there's a sense that what organisations often produce are plans, documents, all of these kind of things, and they produce very little actual action, right? So you have a lot of kind of these bullshit workers employed to kind of create these kind of things. And the final thing, I think, and this is perhaps the most dangerous, is what I'd call neocracy, right? So it's not bureaucracy, development of sort of lots of paperwork, but it's really routine creation of a semblance that things are new, that things are changing and things are new and it's all fantastic and great. But most of the time it's actually just about putting up a front that things look like they're new, but the same sort of stuff continues to go on. So let me give you an example of this. There was a study by a Swedish researcher by the name of Niels Brunson. He looked at the history of the Swedish railways over a 100-year period. And what he found is that every 5 years they would centralize, and then 5 years later they'd decentralize, 5 years later centralize, 5 years later decentralize. And he said the only thing which had changed is that process had sped up. So now it's every year or so that they restructure. So basically what this is pointing towards is that you get a lot of talk about stuff happening, and this kind of continued restructuring, but often very, very little is achieved. And the only thing that actually is achieved is that people's attention gets taken up with doing the restructuring rather than actually delivering the core task.
Okay, so that's interesting. So there's this preoccupation with progress that we see in business life.
Well, it's fake progress most of the
Yeah,
time.
but sort of that we need to feel that things are progressing, evolving, and sort of changing the language is a means for that. Bringing in new terminology, does that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been involved in culture change programs where they invest, tens of millions of dollars or pounds into a culture change program, and then it all just gets thrown aside, and then they try and do the absolute opposite a few years later when a new CEO comes in. So this takes up a huge amount of time, and it can be very dangerous, right? So you mentioned, Saku, that Lucy Callaway now has become a teacher. I pity her in the UK, and the reason for this is this. The UK's teachers work the longest hours in all of Europe, which is, I think, something like 48 hours on average, but they spend 16 hours face-to-face with students. So what are they doing the rest of the time? Teachers from your home country, Finland, work the least, but they spend the most time face-to-face with students. And guess which has the best outcomes? Finland. So what's happened here is that essentially the core task of a teacher, which is teaching, has been whittled down and down and down. And what do they then spend their time doing? Basically form filling, coming up with PowerPoint presentations for students, branding their school, doing all of these other things which are somehow unrelated with their core task. And this happens not just in teaching, it happens in our job, it happens in the medical fields where the times that doctors have to actually do their doctoring becomes smaller, and the times they have to do other things becomes larger, and many other professions. So I think the biggest problem I have, and I think the most dangerous thing about business bullshit, is that it narrows the space for people doing their core task. The reason that you go and pay your money to whichever company, you don't pay your money to a utility provider to, thank you, sir, we're going to be on hold and blah, 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 blah. You pay your money to get phone and gas, like get the core task, not the nonsense alongside of it.
Okay, so that's super interesting, and sort of, I think there's even a darker function for bullshit, which reminds me of your sort of recent book, The Wellness Syndrome, which has been translated to 10 languages, so it has sort of aroused this huge interest. And in this book, André, you look at sort of our preoccupation with happiness and health, that's sort of pervasive in companies. This is actually funny, when you look at sort of the way that typical executives would look like in the 60s, 70s, in the Mad Men era, where they would sort of have a drink for lunch. There would be these thick sort of crystal bottles filled with whiskey. And executives would be grumpy and sort of slightly overweight and so on. Nowadays we see these whippet hounds who are sort of running marathons, ultra marathons, triathlon, and sort of it's changed. Corporate, the corporate sphere is preoccupied with health and happiness. But there's this darker side that we ask, a worker, sort of, are you happy here? So, and that basically means that you're about to get fired. So, either you're already fired or so you're about to be if you don't change your behavior. So there's also, a range of bullshit focused on this sort of happy language.
So you're absolutely right that, we all want to be happy in one way or another. But an over-obsession with it can sometimes be a bit dangerous for a number of reasons. One, there was a really nice psychology study where they basically looked at people who kind of said, they wake up in the morning and say to themselves in the mirror, I'm happy, I deserve to be happy. What this actually showed is that often it led to people being less happy. The reason for this was this. They took two groups. One group, they found out that people really loved watching figure skating, and that tended to make people happy. So they showed them this video. But one group were told to say, I'm happy, having extreme pleasant feelings, etc., is really important to my life before they watched this video. And the other group just said, watch the video. and they took a happiness rating before and after. What they found is the people said all the mantras, I'm happy, etc., actually became less happy after watching the video, right? So looking for happiness and putting it as like this important thing often leads you to feel a little bit disappointed. So that's in private life. But in kind of business life, it can sometimes be a little bit dangerous as well. So happiness, I guess, is a little bit linked with kind of positive thinking. So one of the cases which we discuss in the book is the fate of Nokia.
Don't rub it in. Sorry.
He always starts getting a bit upset sometimes.
Yeah, it's a
when
thin
we
ice
discuss
of
Nokia. But there's one of your friends did this great study where he showed that that the senior executives at Nokia would basically say, don't bring me problems, only bring me solutions. Only bring me good news, positive stuff, right? And Nokia at the time was developing this operating system called Symbian. Do any of you remember Symbian? Which basically the engineers themselves knew wasn't working and was rubbish and they should put it aside. But because they knew if they brought bad news up to the top, that'd be either their division would be closed down or they'd be told, you're not going to get any more workers. No one pushed the bad news up. And as a result, Nokia kept on developing the Symbian for a year later. This was around 2007. So at the time, Nokia was the biggest mobile phone maker in the world, 41% or something like that of the world's phone market. They kept on developing Symbian. And what happened in 2007? iPhone launches. And so too, and along comes Samsung. So they race ahead, and Nokia falls behind. Nokia, until fairly recently, not making mobile phones anymore, but just started doing it. So what happened here is that this tyranny of only bring us positive news meant that people in the company couldn't speak up when something wasn't going right.
Yeah. So this is actually in the newest edition of the Harvard Business Review, which is basically their findings on Nokia. I think, and sort of it's really striking, the notion that really the core of strategy quality can be harmed by sort of a bullshitting discussion culture. So if you don't have discussion norms that allow people to sort of get past that, it can really harm the quality of the core decisions. Yeah. I suppose another aspect is work well-being. Sort of this positive thinking, when you apply it the wrong way, you can remind yourself of Orwell's 1984, where the Ministry of Love was the torture ministry. And so that the whole program of the government was to rewrite language so that people would sort of, talk in the right way. So when you start applying it in certain ways, you get a very, very kind of unhappy organization at the end, I suppose. Yeah,
but also we have to remember that, an example of this, for instance, is the Department of Health in the UK. They were restructuring all the time, which meant that people working there were quite miserable.
Yeah.
And in order to fix it, what they did was give people a 1 hour long mindfulness session on the Wednesday night, right?
Okay.
Which just meant that people had to stay at work longer, right? Which was, mindfulness is very good for dealing with personal anxiety, but it's not great for transforming a fundamentally broken organization. So I think sometimes we see these interventions as doing more than they actually kind of can.
Yeah, so sometimes people's anxiety is a source of real problems, and it could lead to solving those problems rather than doing mindfulness, which I suppose is good. Yeah. So let's look at the organizational aspect a little bit more, but before we do that, let's hear from Lucy a little bit more.
The field in which bullshit talkers excel is when euphemism is called for. And euphemism is never called for quite so much as when companies sack people. Just the other day, I came up with a superb example from a company that delivers sustainability solutions. Now, it was getting rid of some people, and it described it like this. It said its company was going to the gym to engage in cell renewal, which is really quite a nice way of getting rid of people, I think, but not as good as my favourite. My favourite example came from HSBC a few years ago, and it said it was getting rid of some relationship managers, but it wasn't getting rid of them, it was demising them. Now, there's a particular genius to this. The whole point of a euphemism is you take something that's horrible and you make it sound better. But HSBC had got into such a tangle that it had taken something that was horrible, i.e. taking away people's jobs, and made it sound as if it was actually killing them. My other favourite, which maybe I like even more than HSBC, is EY, which got rid of some of its partners recently, sent an email round to everyone else saying, "We look forward to strengthening our alumni network."
So, now we're both organizational theorists. We know that, and everybody in the room knows that an organization can do fantastic things. You know, when people come together in an organization, they can send people to different planets. They can build intricate technological things like the, you know, say a typical iPhone. As an engineer, you know, I'm just flabbergasted at what my iPhone can do. It's just amazing what organizations can do together. So this is stuff that no individual could accomplish by themselves. But then we also know that organizations can be remarkably stupid. So we know, you know, just think of, you know, find your favorite example of sort of an educated person who works in a job who just becomes increasingly dumb. I'm thinking of Canadian immigration for some reason, I don't know why, but sort of, you know, these are highly trained people, and sort of, you know, my interactions with them has sometimes been sort of, you know, has almost brought me to tears. So what is organizational stupidity? That's one of André's brilliant ideas, that we shouldn't be looking at organizational knowledge, the brilliant stuff, but really organizational stupidity.
Yeah.
So why do organizations make us so dumb sometimes?
Well, we spent some time studying these kind of so-called knowledge-intensive firms, you know, consultancies, investment banks, law firms, etc. And you talked with them and they said, we're super intelligent, we're extremely knowledgeable, knowledge, blah, blah, blah. We only hire the best and the brightest. So they spent a lot of time emphasizing how smart they were. But when you actually got the people who worked them to the side, maybe took them for a beer after work, they would often say, you know, what I do is pretty stupid most of the time. It's pretty useless. I polish up PowerPoint decks, I fetch people coffee, I turn up in a nice suit and I talk a lot of nonsense, which means nothing. And my job is actually pretty stupid. In fact, I do stupid stuff. So I was like, well, why does that happen? And we spent quite a long time trying to study how these smart organizations do stupid things. And what we realized is that stupidity, the reason these smart people become stupid is because it pays off, right? Essentially what happens is, you imagine your new graduate comes into this knowledge-intensive firm. They realize that they've got, you know, their MBA or whatever, and then they're essentially doing a job which could be done by someone who's a high school graduate in many cases, right? Which is the uncomfortable truth in some cases. And then they think, okay, and then they start thinking, okay, well, what's some opportunities where I can use my knowledge? So the problem with smart people is that they point things out, they bring up new ideas, and that can be sometimes a little bit troublesome for people. And then they start bringing up things, and then their seniors are like, well, that's a good idea, but it's a bit inconvenient or difficult. So maybe what you should do is just not think about it too much more and just do something. Switch off your brain and just do it, right? So they're subtly encouraged to do this. And because they're smart, they very, very quickly realize that that's what's going to benefit them. So they begin to sort of self-stupefy, not ask too many questions, not look into things too much, not examine stuff, and just do it. And they get benefits from it in terms of they get promoted. Their life is a bit easier because they're not creating problems for themselves, and they get along well with their fellow colleagues. Everything is great until the problem happens. Now, the problem is with self-stupefaction is that you begin to overlook small problems or issues, and which can be fine. Organizations are very big places, and it's easy to lose problems in them. That's great. But sometimes those small problems can add up to big disasters. So an example of this we saw during, say, the financial crisis, where if you talk with people about many of these complex financial products, is even the people who developed them didn't understand how they worked, right? So then that gave rise to some serious problems, which kind of, you know, nearly bankrupted many countries across the world, and certainly nearly bankrupted many banks. So I think there's some significant dangers which can happen with this kind of self-stupefaction and organizational stupidity.
Okay, so there's all this preoccupation with talent these days. I think sort of any company with sort of any self-respect is focused on getting the best talent and developing, retaining, and then maybe demising that talent. But but still, talent is and the all-important thing. So why is it that we see these forces of self-stupefaction that you were talking about? It's kind of nearing a bullshit term, by the way, self-stupefacation. But anyway, sort of why is it that we're seeing those forces at play in companies that are so preoccupied with getting the best talent?
Because talent is dangerous, basically, and most organisations just need to get the job done.
Yeah.
And if people are actually completely using their talent, often it's going to create problems in that organisation, conflict and those kind of things. But companies need to put up an image that they're talented, right? So often hiring smart people is, in some cases, more of an image creation exercise rather than necessary for what they're actually doing. Not always, but sometimes.
Yeah, so when you introduce smart people with a lot of initiative, you know, they might want to change things and do sort of other stuff than the company is tasked with.
Yeah.
And that's actually, so that's a real problem. How do you manage that?
Exactly. And they might actually begin doing things and it costs time, energy, money, disturbs people higher up, all sorts of things. So this is the problem.
Okay. So let's focus on what we can actually do. We have a video? Let's see.
Well, as laughing at companies, it's more fun to laugh at individuals. So I just want to end with 3 examples. They're all very, very different, but I think you'll agree in their separate ways they're brilliant. The first is from someone you may not have heard of. He's called Rob Stone. He's CEO of a US advertising agency called Cornerstone. His goes like this. As brands build out a world footprint, they look for the no-holds-barred global POV that's always been part of our wheelhouse. Well, that's pretty good. That is a 4-way mixed metaphor, a hell of a lot of hot air that says nothing at all. Possibly, though, better still is Angela Ahrendts. This is when she was CEO of Burberry, and she wrote this in the company's annual report. In the wholesale channel, Burberry exited doors not aligned with brand status and invested in presentation through both enhanced assortments and dedicated, customised real estate in key doors. I have shown that to all sorts of business people over the years and asked them what they think it means. I've never had an answer, and I've never understood why a company that makes raincoats goes on quite so much about doors. Finally, though, this is the most bullshitty example I've ever come across. And what's so interesting about it is that there are no fancy words or anything. But I hope you will agree with me. It's from John Chambers when he was CEO of Cisco. He sent out an email to all of his people. It began team, and it ended, "We'll wake the world up and move the planet a little closer to the future." The hubris of that is quite something. And actually, since then, I think the planet has been reaching the future pretty nicely without the help of Cisco.
Okay, so let's get a bit more positive. So, André, in your book, you talk, you give a lot of good ideas on how we can manage in a way that doesn't perpetuate the bullshit culture. So, what are the ideas that you have?
So there are many organisations which are concerned with cutting the bullshit in different kinds of ways. And what can we do? So there's one Australian firm called Atlassian. It's a kind of a software development firm, and one of their core values is no bullshit, right? My question is whether that just leads to a little bit more bullshit as well. So there's some firms that value this no bullshit culture. Some people can just make fun of it, right? So you can easily download on your iPhone now, if you'd like, a bullshit bingo card, which you can take to your next business meeting and tick things off, right? Or you can make use of bullshit strategically. So in 1944, at the end of World War II, the CIA dropped across Europe something called the Field Sabotage Manual, and it gave advice to people across Europe how to sabotage the kind of Nazi machine from the inside. And one of the pieces of advice in this was increase the amount of jargon you use, increase administrative procedures, make sure that meetings last as long as possible, appoint people, send information up and down again, all of these kind of things. And you look, this is almost exactly the kind of recipe for bullshit. So bullshit could be potentially used to bring down an organization. So that's how, those are kind of the sort of funny sides of it. But I think that there's sort of ways we could actually kind of intervene and make a more serious attempt to cut it out. And I think there's a really simple thing which anyone can do who's a manager or in a team. And it's simply, when you're talking about something, apply these kind of 3 tests. The truth test, what's the evidence about this? What do we actually know about it? Are you actually talking about something concrete? Remarkably, in many walks of life, we very rarely say, what do we actually know? What's the evidence?
Right, so we go back to the definition of bullshit. So, is this something that we could demonstrate or explore empirically? Could we get data on what you're claiming?
Yeah. And there's lots of evidence out there, which, business schools like this create high quality evidence about things, about corporate decision making. It's very rarely kind of consultant. So that's the first point. The second thing is the logic test. Does this actually make sense? There was a really great psychological study done, which was, it worked like this. It got people into the room and said to them, how much do you know about toilets, right? And most people would think, well, I use them every day, so I know out of 10, 9 out of 10, right?
Until you go to Japan, right? So then you don't know anything about them. Yeah.
But then they asked, okay, describe to me as much detail how a toilet actually works. And then people begin scratching their head and they're not sure about it, and then they try and describe it, how it works. And then you ask them again, how much do you know about toilets? And they'll tend to say 4 out of 10, right? Think about the same kind of example. You want to introduce a new IT system. How much do you know about the IT system? Well, I know lots about the IT system. Tell me how it works. Well, not really sure. And then people are more likely then to listen to experts, to take into account how it actually works and think about the logic. So thinking about how it actually works is the second point. And the final thing is it meaningful? Does this actually mean something to other people? So test out meaning against other people. So I think those are some simple tests people could apply. But also we need to kind of address the structural aspects, I think. So I think one thing we could do is looking at the bullshit aspects in our own jobs. All of us have these bits where we're doing some work and we know this is utterly pointless. Sometimes we have to do it, but sometimes we actually have some freedom to just say no, right? All of the work on personal productivity suggests that what you need to do is to look at what you're doing in your life, ask the question, what's the pointless stuff which you're doing, which is probably checking email, surfing social media, attending meetings where you know that there's no point, and just refuse. Say, if there's no decision being made in this meeting, I'm not turning up, right? Or if something, there's some space where you can actually do this. Get rid of corporate escapism. I think corporations create a lot of ways of actually escaping from the real problems.
What do you mean by that? That's an interesting term.
Well, if you've got a problem, you often go on a extremely long strategic retreat or something like this, go horse riding rather than actually dealing with the problem, right? And the final thing is asking yourself, what's your core task? What are you here to do? If you're a teacher, you're not here to fill in forms and engage in branding exercises and stuff. You're there to teach students. If you're a medic, you're there to treat patients. If you're an academic like us, you're here to teach people, do some research and help the institution run a little bit. So asking what's that core task? And then the final thing, I think, is giving organizations a little bit of space for people to speak up. So when things are not necessarily going right, allowing people to be able to sort of say, hey, I don't know, or this isn't going not so well, even if they don't necessarily have a solution, I think.
So I'm kind of reminded, I think there's an undercurrent to what you're saying, which involves fear. So there's a lot of sort of fear in corporate life. I suppose we're very preoccupied with risk. So that's one of the reasons why teachers fill out those forms, because there's a bureaucrat somewhere who is liable for some or the other aspect, of the youth, which often are sort of real life concerns. But they're trying to manage their risk by sort of putting in place procedures that then actually bog down the organization and sort of end up in all this bullshit.
So what they're not just trying to manage risk, but they're trying to make it seem like they're managing risk, right? So create the structure where it apparently seems like you're doing something, right? Rather than actually doing it. And this can be really dangerous. So I was speaking recently to the medical director of Great Ormond Street Hospital in London, which is one of the world's leading paediatric institutions. And he made the point that many of his young colleagues will very rarely take on risky cases anymore. And one of the reasons for that is that they're just worried about the negative impact it's going to have potentially on their career. So the result is that risky cases just don't get picked up anymore.
Yeah, that's I'm reminded by our good friend and colleague Henry Mintzberg, who recently actually did have an open heart bypass. And he, after that, he's often given the example that he would like to get a doctor who's sort of, who's killed a lot of people, rather than the doctor who sort of has a perfect success rate, for the reason that sort of, the doctor who has a perfect success rate, does not take any complex cases. Yeah. So he wants one who actually sort of is willing to sort of to face really difficult cases. So it's actually funny. He's right to the point of what you're saying. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so let's kind of do some navel gazing towards the end. So piled higher and deeper. There's a joke about the academic life, the question, what does BSc mean? Bullshit. What does MSc mean? More shit. And what does PhD mean? Piled higher and deeper, as you see there. So Andrea and I sort of represent the piled higher and deeper aspect here, being in front. So is it, we're talking about the next 50 years of the MBA. Is it going to be sort of the next 50 years of business bullshit, or sort of, what should we be doing in not perpetuating it, but actually sort of helping people cut through that?
A few years ago, one of my colleagues did a study on Warwick University, where I used to work and you used to work. And they asked the MBA students, what did you get out of your MBA, right? And they asked them a few years afterwards. And the only things which were enduring is, I can talk a lot of nonsense, and I'm happy with the language. I'm happy with the language, is the way in which they said it, and social networks. And I forgot a lot of the actual stuff which I learned. And Warwick tried to change some aspects and address that, and I think many business schools across the world, including this one, are trying to address that, trying to make sure that knowledge is, that the important skills are being taught, which people hold on to. And I think some of those skills, so one of the things which we're doing at, there's a couple of initiatives I've mentioned. One is what's called evidence-based management, which is this idea of providing data sets for corporate decision making. Of, say, if you're going to introduce the current trend at the moment is what's called unconscious bias training, for instance, to deal with diversity issues. Not a lot of good evidence that it actually works. Sometimes it actually can have the opposite effect. There's loads of other examples of these, providing evidence around stuff so people can make decisions about centralization and decentralization. So that's the first thing, providing evidence and skilling people to actually use that evidence. The second thing which we're doing at CAS at the moment is, in London, is educating people in skills of critical thinking. So if you look at the debate about automation, what you see from many different councils is they're asking this question, what are the skills which are going to be important in the future? And normally one of the skills which comes out in the top 2 or 3 is critical thinking skills, right? But often in the past, business schools have been remarkably poor at educating students in critical thinking skills. So I think actually building that centrally into the curriculum is an important part of it. And then the third thing I think which McGill does a great job on is this integrative thinking. I think bringing things together rather than leaving things in kind of silos. So I think those are some things which business schools can do to be a kind of force against this kind of BS and against stupidity in organizations. Yeah,
and one could perhaps see that it's a very fortunate thing that sort of this big data, the preoccupation with data and evidence that's happening, and that's a big range of interest, because teaching people to deal with data actually teaches them to deal with evidence and to reason as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I think in corporate life, I think being able to deal with data, deal with evidence, and think in critical ways can actually help to increase the quality of our decision making and hopefully increase the quality of our organisations more generally.